in military history, they usually think about Shaka and the Zulu and how great they were. And if you're more advanced, you usually think about the Almoravid Empire under the Moors and their leader Abu Bukhari and how they took parts of southern Spain. Let's be honest, most people think the Zulu were Africa's most powerful military because essentially the British told you to believe that. The truth is, though, there's a more ancient African nation with a far better track record than the Zulu and even the Moors of North Africa. The Moors of North Africa, or even the Songhai of West Africa, when it comes to Africa's greatest military, right? And I really hope nobody was thinking about the Egyptians. They were by far the most inconsistent military in all of Africa. This particular African nation that I'm thinking about right now in my head took on nearly all the world's superpowers at the time and either completely body bagged them or decided to come to a mutual understanding. For whatever reason, non-African nations didn't want no smoke when it came to ancient Kush. I hope you guys see what I did there. So yeah, guys, we're talking about ancient Kush. If we take a real, genuine look at the history of Kush and just the region in general, it all just speaks for itself. Now, some of you guys may agree that ancient Kush was probably one of the most underrated nations in African history, but very rarely would anybody call ancient Kush the greatest concerning its military. But I'm suggesting to you today that their military history and their reputation worldwide made Kush the greatest African military in all of African history, which is in the region of Sudan today. Most people incorrectly believe the first civilization in Africa was Egypt, but that's actually incorrect. Egypt was not the first civilization in Africa. The first recognized civilization in Africa was a Nubian one that the Egyptians called Tasseti. And the Egyptians called it Tasseti not in relation to some description of the people or the land or even the animals. They called it Tasseti because of its military prowess. Tasseti means land of the bow because the Egyptians knew that these Nubians were excellent archers, and from their perspective, these Nubians were the best in the world. So right off the bat, the Nubians were recognized for their particular militaristic character. So let's talk about the first four. How can you say that the Kushites were the most powerful military in African history if the Egyptians defeated them? The answer to that is twofold. Number one, that region that we would later associate as Kush was not unified like Egypt was. Because Egypt had more political and economic structure, many Nubians would go to Egypt for work, especially for the Egyptian military. And that leads us to our second point. Egyptians employed Nubians all the time in their military. Even King Xerxes of Persia employed Nubian archers. Weni the Elder, who was a court official in Egypt, mentioned how Egyptians employed Nubian soldiers. All the time. When His Majesty took action against the Asiatic sand dwellers, His Majesty made an army of many tens of thousands from all of Upper Egypt, from Lower Egypt, and from Egypt Nubians, Medja Nubians, Yam Nubians, Wawat Nubians, Kau Nubians, and from Jeme land. Notice the diversity of the Nubians and how there wasn't necessarily any unified Nubian identity that would later become Kush. When you have Nubians that are employed by you, who have extensive knowledge of Nubia, its people, and perhaps its military capability, it becomes way easier to conquer the region. So Egypt had a tremendous advantage from the start. But the Egyptians began to notice something. The region started to become more unified, and this is where we suddenly see the Egyptians refer to the region as something totally different. Kush, or as they would say in their propaganda, vile Kush. We had a new identity forming in the region called the Kushites, and that's when the greatest military in African history was formed. After Kush gained its independence from Egypt, Egypt was never able to bang with the Kushites again. In fact, the bitter rivalry between Kush and Egypt ended when Kush conquered Egypt. The fact that Kush conquered Egypt, however, is not really the story like most would think. It's the relative ease in which Kush ran through Egypt. You see, nobody really mentions the time before Kush conquered Egypt, when the Kushites ran through Egypt, but simply decided not to stay and occupy it. Truly a sign of domination. It was a time that literally scared the crap out of Egypt. And as some scholars say, the Egyptians airbrushed this right out of the history books. And the 25th dynasty of Egypt was created. The first non-African nation the Kushites encountered were the Assyrians. Now, the Assyrians at the time were running through everybody. They were the ones who kicked the Kushites out of Egypt. This one is strange because even though the Assyrians were successful in the seesaw battle of power and influence, they never sought to go further south and attempt to conquer Kush. Perhaps that was their policy at the time. You would think after a long battle with Kush, you would want to ensure the southern neighbor of Egypt would no longer compete with you.
This is the remarkable story of how a 16th century African man named Yasuke sailed halfway around the world and rose from slavery to Japan's highest honor of samurai. 16th century Japan was largely closed off to the outside world. The country was divided into provinces ruled by local feudal lords called daimyos. During this period, European explorers began to sail to every hemisphere of the world, a time referred to as the Age of Exploration. Portuguese explorers were the first to arrive in Japan, bringing with them their language, religion, and slavery. People ripped from their homelands in Africa were sold into servitude aboard Portuguese ships that sailed around the world. Yasuke was one of these slaves. Little is known about Yasuke's origins. He may have lived in Mozambique before being taken into slavery. Eventually, he came into the possession of a Jesuit missionary named Alessandro Valignano, who was one of the first Europeans to bring Christianity to the Far East. The letters of his fellow Jesuit, Luis Frois, provide much of the written account of Yasuke's story. He would have been one of the first Africans ever seen in Japan. Curious townspeople were so desperate to get a look at him that they broke down the Jesuits' door to get in. Some even perished in the onslaught. Lord Oda Nobunaga became very interested in European culture and helped the Jesuits build a church in Kyoto. When Yasuke first came before Lord Nobunaga, he was described as a young man who stood over 6 feet tall and whose strength surpassed that of 10 men. The daimyo was so convinced that Yasuke's skin had been dyed with ink that at one point he ordered the slave to strip to his waist and scrub his body. The two developed a sort of friendship, and even though Yasuke could only speak a little Japanese, he greatly impressed Lord Nobunaga, who reportedly enjoyed talking with him. Lord Nobunaga granted Yasuke a sum of money, a house, and a katana, and at this point, the slave graduated from an object of Portuguese property to a member of the daimyo's advisors and loyally served him as an honored samurai. Yasuke the Black Samurai was now part of the Japanese elite. In 1582, one of Lord Nobunaga's associates betrayed him and led an attack on his castle. Yasuke fought bravely in defense of his master, but when Nobunaga foresaw imminent defeat, he committed seppuku rather than face dishonor. Yasuke continued to battle long after all was lost, until he finally surrendered his sword to the enemy. They spared his life because he wasn't Japanese, but they sent him back to the Jesuits. What happened after this is lost to history, but thankfully his story and the mark he made on history continues to be shared centuries later.
Movie on Yasuke, and this has definitely created some buzz within the Afro-descended world. Some are hesitant, however, in their excitement, and rightfully so, as Hollywood doesn't exactly have the best record when it comes to advancing Black narratives. So today, we're going to be discussing the history of Yasuke, and also a brief history on Africans in Japan during the 16th century. And then we'll get into the larger topic on what Hollywood needs to get right based on this context. So stay tuned. What up, African world? It's Home Team here, and I'm back at it with another video of African history, culture, and worldview. And as always, if you want to support the Home Team, you can do so on patreon.com. I have some new rewards for you guys, so be sure to check that out. Also, go to afrographics.com, a website where you can find unique illustrative infographics summarizing African history. All links to Patreon, Afrographics, and Home Team merchandise are in the description box below. Yasuke was a 16th century African, likely from southeastern Africa, who served as a samurai under the Japanese warlord Oda Nobunaga. Now, before we get into the history of Yasuke, let's first discover the relationship between the Japanese and African people in general. The Japanese encounter with Africans dates back to 1546, when 3 Portuguese ships arrived in Japan carrying Africans likely from Mozambique or in the general vicinity of the Swahili coast. One Catholic priest already in Japan reported the incident in a letter to his colleague. The Catholic priest speaks about the sheer excitement and overwhelming interest the Japanese had about witnessing African people as they had never seen them before. Many came to see the Negro all the way from as far as a distance of 60 miles. The Italian missionary Gennecchi Organtino, who came to Japan in 1570, also wrote in a letter claiming that the Japanese would pay money to see slaves from Ethiopia. Negro fever in Japan was in full effect, and it became so prominent that Gennecchi even suggested that Jesuits who found themselves in bad financial shape should actually bring Negroes with them. This infatuation with black people in Japan gives us the perfect backdrop for the story of Yasuke. Yasuke was undoubtedly the most relevant African in Japanese history. In general, people love the story of Yasuke, but we seldom understand why he was so important. Yasuke is significant because he contributed to one of the most critical periods in Japanese history, the Sengoku period, a period marked by constant military conflict over the unification of Japan. In other words, this period in Japanese history helped to shape what Japan looks like today. Padre Alessandro Valignani, an Italian missionary, brought Yasuke to Kyoto, Japan, and news spread rapidly of his arrival. Upon hearing this, the local Japanese population congregated in the city, threw stones, and even pulled down walls and gates just to get a glimpse at Yasuke. Oda Nobunaga was apparently impressed with Yasuke. His written chronicle had some very glowing things to say about him. A black man came from a Christian country. His age seemed somewhere around 26 or 27. He is as black as a cow and looks healthy and talented. He is stronger than 10 powerful men. Now, from our modern lens, this may seem extraordinarily racist, but this was actually a genuine compliment with no undercurrent of 21st century baggage. The Japanese apparently called black people kokujin or kokudo. Thus, instead of simply calling the African visitor Kokudo, Oda Nobunaga decided to give him a name, Yasuke. Naming him alludes to the fact that Nobunaga knew Yasuke was meant for more, so he inquired about Yasuke's permanent residency in Japan, essentially to become his royal retainer. And this is where the story of Yasuke takes off. Yasuke became so beloved by the Japanese ruler that he acquired the esteemed title of samurai. Yasuke apparently even spoke some Japanese and had delightful conversations with Lord Nobunaga. Yasuke was reportedly given his own residence and a katana weapon. Upon his baptism, if you will, into the samurai brotherhood, Yasuke fought alongside Nobunaga's forces. After various battles and skirmishes, Lord Nobunaga's forces were eventually defeated by the Akechi. Yasuke was captured by the Akechi forces, but was later released, and this ends our recorded history of Yasuke. It's interesting to know the diversity concerning Japanese opinion on Africans and even Europeans. Many Japanese viewed Africans with awe and intrigue, with no apparent idea to their inferiority, but some other Japanese viewed Africans as beast. On the same coin, you had Japanese opinion on various European groups. Southern Europeans were called Nabanjin, literally meaning southern barbarians, and Northern Europeans were known as Kamojin, literally meaning red-haired men. They were also known as long-nosed goblins or giant monsters. So it does seem as though the Japanese distributed their prejudice equally. So since Hollywood decided to take the story on, what do they need to get right? Well, the story of Yasuke gives Hollywood a lot of wiggle room for creative license, as there are many gaps of knowledge. First, it'll be interesting to see if Hollywood advances the idea that Yasuke was initially a slave. There is no real solid evidence that Yasuke was indeed enslaved, but given the history of interaction between the Swahili coast and the rest of the world in general, slavery was unfortunately a big function of that economy during that time. Any African seen in India or Asia would have likely come through that dehumanizing route. In fact, the Chinese called enslaved Africans Sengchi, so their presence was not uncommon. In all honesty, I would be surprised if Hollywood didn't go that route with Yasuke, because it would be very easy to advance. In my opinion, if Hollywood wants to get it right, they should leave this initial status open for interpretation, which unfortunately would be rather difficult to pull off on the big screen. The next thing Hollywood needs to get right is Japanese opinion on Africans. Historically, as I've mentioned before, the Japanese view on African people was largely neutral, neither all positive nor all negative. In fact, the 16th century view of Africans in Japan was more romanticized, if anything, as the Japanese had not fully developed any foundational views on African people. So if Hollywood wants to get it right, most of the movies should portray Yasuke's relationship with Japan as a glowing one. It was only upon his capture by the enemy that Yasuke became inferior or undesirable. But one can attribute that to either his enemy status or his African status. And finally, what Hollywood should get right is the ending. We have no record of what actually happened to Yasuke after his capture and release, so Hollywood can essentially do anything with that. In my own bias, if they showed Yasuke returning to Africa, that would be the frosting on the cake. That is, if they're only planning on doing one movie. If not, they should probably make Yasuke's ending pretty open so that they can do another one. Closing this book on Yasuke wouldn't be a smart move in my opinion.